It was a crisp autumn morning when Sarah Jenkins, a 32-year-old freelance writer, walked into the bustling clinic of Dr. David Lee. The air was filled with the usual scent of antiseptic and the hum of nurses calling patients, but Sarah was far from her usual self. She had always been healthy, maintaining a balanced diet and staying active, but recently something had felt off. It was subtle at first: nausea in the mornings, a slight dizziness, and an unexplained craving for pickles. Her mind raced with the possibilities. She wasn't sure why, but something inside her believed she could be pregnant. She had been feeling it for weeks, but every time she hesitated to take a test, doubt crept in. After all, she had always been careful, taking precautions to avoid such a thing. But now, it seemed like something she couldn't ignore any longer. When the nurse called her name, Sarah stood up, her stomach tight with nerves. She had only told a few close friends about her suspicions, and they had been mostly supportive, though some were a bit skeptical. "It's probably nothing," her best friend Rebecca had said the week before. "You're just stressed from work." But this felt different. Inside the examination room, Dr. David Lee greeted her with a friendly smile. He was a seasoned doctor, well respected in the community. Sarah had been to him for checkups before, but this was different. She explained her symptoms to him in detail, from the nausea to the tenderness in her chest and the unusual cravings. He listened attentively, nodding thoughtfully. After a series of questions, he suggested taking a blood test and an ultrasound to get to the bottom of it. "I know it's hard, Sarah, but it's best to confirm these things with proper tests," Dr. Lee said kindly, his voice soothing. Sarah nodded and agreed. The ultrasound came next, and she lay back on the cold table, watching as the technician applied gel to her abdomen. The machine hummed to life, and the technician moved the wand over her skin, focusing on the screen. Sarah's heart raced as she waited for the results, her mind in turmoil. Was this the moment her life was about to change? The technician was silent for a few moments, and Sarah's anxiety only grew. Then, she heard a soft click as the technician printed out a few images. "I'll let the doctor review these," the technician said, and Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. A few minutes later, Dr. Lee returned to the room with the images. His expression was neutral, and he sat down on a chair beside her. He cleared his throat. "Sarah, I have some news for you," Dr. Lee began. His voice had a reassuring tone, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that began to settle in her chest. "You're pregnant." The words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. She blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Pregnant? Was this really happening? How could this be? Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. She was stunned, her hands trembling as she gripped the sides of the examination table. It was the last thing she had expected. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice wavering. Dr. Lee nodded. "Yes, the ultrasound shows a clear image of a fetus, and your blood work confirms the pregnancy. Based on the size of the fetus, you're about 8 weeks along." Sarah's heart raced as the weight of the situation settled in. She had always wanted children, but the timing felt all wrong. How would she manage this change in her life? She had never imagined this moment would come in such an unexpected way. For a moment, Sarah was speechless. The doctor went on to discuss her options, but she barely heard him. All she could think about was the shock of the news. How was she going to tell her parents, her friends, her colleagues? Dr. Lee continued, explaining the next steps for prenatal care, but Sarah's mind was far away, lost in a swirl of questions. Was she really ready for this? How had she not known sooner? She had never missed a period, and there hadn't been any obvious signs before this sudden turn of events. When Sarah left the clinic later that day, she was in a daze. Her mind raced with the news, the excitement, and the fear of what was to come. She had scheduled an appointment for a follow-up in a few weeks, but for now, all she could do was think about what this news meant for her life. Later that evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the positive pregnancy test she had taken earlier that day, the one that had confirmed what she had suspected. Her hands shook slightly as she thought back to the doctor's words. Pregnant. It seemed so surreal. She picked up her phone and texted Rebecca. "You won't believe what I found out today. I'm pregnant." As the message sent, Sarah felt a mix of emotions. Excitement, anxiety, fear, they all swirled inside her like a storm she couldn't control. She had so many questions, so many uncertainties. And most of all, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Little did Sarah know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her body and the life she was about to bring into the world. Over the next week, Sarah tried to settle into the reality of her situation. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family. Rebecca was thrilled for her, as were a few other close friends. But there was something about the constant stream of congratulations and excitement that only added to Sarah's confusion. She had yet to tell her parents, unsure how to break the news to them. She didn't feel ready. Something was gnawing at her, a persistent sense that something wasn't quite right. Despite the overwhelming support, Sarah couldn't help but feel something was off. Her body didn't feel like it was changing as quickly as she had expected. Her breasts were still tender, and she occasionally felt a twinge of nausea, but she hadn't experienced the severe morning sickness that many women described in early pregnancy. And she still hadn't gained any weight. In fact, she felt as though she was losing weight, despite the cravings for pickles and the like. One evening, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She called Dr. Lee's office and asked for another appointment. It was now nearly 2 weeks since her initial ultrasound, and she was growing increasingly uneasy. "Hi, this is Sarah Jenkins," she said when the receptionist answered. "I'd like to schedule a follow-up appointment with Dr. Lee. I have some concerns about my pregnancy." There was a slight pause on the other end before the receptionist responded. "Of course, let me check Dr. Lee's schedule. How soon would you like to come in?" "ASAP, please," Sarah replied, her voice betraying her growing sense of urgency. The receptionist quickly found an opening for Sarah the following day, and she agreed without hesitation. The next day, Sarah sat in the waiting room, fidgeting nervously. She had spent the night Googling everything she could about phantom pregnancies, a condition she had heard about only briefly in passing. What if this was all in her head? What if she had convinced herself she was pregnant when, in reality, her body was playing tricks on her? When Dr. Lee walked in, he immediately noticed the look of worry on Sarah's face. "Sarah, it's good to see you again. How are you feeling?" he asked, taking a seat beside her. "I'm not sure," she replied. Something doesn't feel right. I haven't had the typical symptoms people talk about, like morning sickness, and I'm not gaining any weight. I still don't really feel pregnant." Dr. Lee nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand your concerns. It's not uncommon for some women to have very mild symptoms in early pregnancy, and every pregnancy is different. But if you're feeling uncertain, we can run a few more tests. We can do another ultrasound or take another blood test to check the hormone levels." Sarah sighed in relief. The uncertainty had been eating away at her, and she felt a little better knowing Dr. Lee was taking her seriously. "I'd like to do that," she said. "Please." Dr. Lee stood and motioned for her to follow him into the examination room. He quickly set up the ultrasound machine, and within minutes, the cool gel was spread across Sarah's abdomen once again. As the technician moved the wand over her stomach, Sarah could see the images flickering on the screen. The same faint outlines from her previous ultrasound appeared, but this time, the images seemed different. Less clear, less solid. There was a sense of emptiness in the flickering shadows. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. Dr. Lee, who had been observing the screen closely, hesitated before responding. "The images, they aren't as clear as before. Let me take a look at the blood work from your last test." The technician printed out a new set of images, and Dr. Lee reviewed them carefully. Sarah's heart began to race again. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Had the pregnancy been a mistake? Were they wrong to begin with? "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, a feeling of dread creeping in. "If I'm not pregnant, then what is all of this?" The test, the ultrasound, why do I feel like this? Dr. Lee took a deep breath and sat beside her. His expression was grave, but not without compassion. Sarah, I believe you may be experiencing what's called a phantom pregnancy or a pseudocyesis. It's extremely rare, but it's possible for a woman's body to exhibit symptoms of pregnancy even though there's no actual fetus present. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. What? But how? I mean, I've been feeling everything. The nausea, the cravings, the tenderness. I thought it was real. It feels real, Sarah, Dr. Lee said gently. Your body has reacted as if it is pregnant. The hormonal changes, the physical symptoms, they can all be very convincing. But the tests, the ultrasounds, they show no evidence of a pregnancy. A chill ran through Sarah as the words sunk in. So, I'm not pregnant, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Lee shook his head. No, Sarah. You're not. The room felt suddenly small, and Sarah's thoughts raced. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. She had spent days thinking her life was about to change, only to find out that everything she had felt was a lie. Her body had convinced her of something that wasn't true. I don't understand, Sarah murmured, her voice shaky with emotion. How is this even possible? Dr. Lee explained that phantom pregnancies were rare, but they were caused by a complex mix of psychological and physiological factors. In some cases, women's bodies would react to the stress, anxiety, or deep desire for a child by producing symptoms that mimicked pregnancy. The condition was not understood fully, but it was believed to be linked to hormonal imbalances, psychological stress, or an overwhelming need for emotional fulfillment. You're not alone in this, Sarah, Dr. Lee reassured her. Though it may feel incredibly isolating, this condition is not your fault. It can happen for many reasons, and we can help you work through it. Sarah sat there, numb. It was almost too much to process. Everything she had believed, everything she had felt in her body, had been an illusion. For the next few days, Sarah's world seemed to shatter. Every time she looked in the mirror, her mind couldn't reconcile the reality with the illusion she had been living. She was still feeling the same physical symptoms, nausea, cravings, fatigue. But now, the connection she had felt with the idea of being pregnant seemed like a cruel trick her body had played on her. The hardest part was the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Her body had convinced her that something was happening inside of her, something that she had hoped for, dreamed of, for years. To have that dream stripped away so suddenly, without explanation, left her feeling hollow. She avoided her phone for several days, not wanting to deal with the constant messages. She didn't want to tell anyone the truth. How could she? Everyone had congratulated her, including her parents, who were so excited about becoming grandparents. Sarah couldn't bear to face their disappointment. The thought of seeing the look of confusion and concern in their eyes made her heart ache. Rebecca was the first to reach out, texting her several times, and Sarah finally responded, asking if they could talk. I need to explain something to you, Sarah wrote. Rebecca immediately called her, and Sarah answered the phone, her voice low and hesitant. Hey, I don't know how to say this, but there's something I need to tell you. I'm not pregnant. There was a long pause on the other end, and Sarah could almost hear Rebecca's confusion through the silence. What do you mean? I thought you had an ultrasound, that you were going to be a mom. You were so sure. I was sure, Sarah said softly, her voice trembling. But I wasn't pregnant. It's called a phantom pregnancy. I've been going through all these symptoms, nausea, cravings, tenderness, but there's no baby. It was all in my head. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Oh my God, Sarah. I'm so sorry. I didn't know that was even possible. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. Sarah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. It's just, everything. I felt so sure. I was already imagining what my life would be like, you know? And now I feel like I've lost something I never even had. I can't even begin to imagine how difficult that must be, Rebecca said softly. But Sarah, this doesn't change who you are or how amazing you are. You deserve to have your dream come true, whether it's right now or later. I'll be here for you, no matter what. Her words, though comforting, couldn't erase the void Sarah was feeling. She had been so sure, so excited, and now it felt as though she had been living a fantasy. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions of her daily routine, but everything felt empty. Even her work as a freelance writer, which she had always found fulfilling, felt meaningless. Her focus was scattered, and she couldn't bring herself to sit down and finish an article. Each time she tried, her thoughts would wander back to the phantom pregnancy. To the hope she had briefly felt and then lost. Sarah's visits to Dr. Lee continued, though they were now more focused on her emotional health than her physical well-being. He had explained that she would likely need some counseling to help her process the psychological impact of what had happened. This condition can leave a lasting emotional toll, Dr. Lee had said. It's important to acknowledge what you've been through, to give yourself time to grieve the loss, even if that loss is something that wasn't technically there. At first, Sarah didn't want to talk to anyone about it. How could she? She felt like a failure, like she had somehow tricked herself into believing in something that wasn't real. But Dr. Lee's words stuck with her. Give yourself permission to feel, he had urged. This is a real loss, even if the pregnancy never existed. She started seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in women's health and reproductive trauma. At her first session, she sat across from the therapist, a kind woman named Evelyn, who asked her to recount the events in her own words. Sarah hesitated at first, but then the floodgates opened. She told Evelyn everything, the symptoms, the ultrasound, the devastating realization that she wasn't pregnant. Evelyn listened intently, her expression warm and understanding. What you're experiencing is incredibly painful, Sarah, she said gently. It's normal to feel confused, sad, or even angry. The physical symptoms you had were real, and your emotional attachment to the idea of pregnancy was real, too. This isn't something you can just brush off. Over time, Sarah began to open up more. She learned that while phantom pregnancies were rare, they were not unheard of. Some women experienced them after a deep emotional loss, such as a miscarriage, or after trying unsuccessfully to conceive. In Sarah's case, the stress of her freelance career, the uncertainty about her future, and the deep desire for a child had all combined to trigger the phantom pregnancy. Her body had misread the signals, and the result was a series of false but very convincing symptoms. As Sarah processed her emotions, she began to recognize how deeply this experience had affected her sense of self-worth. She had never realized how much she had tied her identity to the idea of becoming a mother. Her friends and family had always assumed she would have children one day, and Sarah had never stopped to question that expectation until now. I don't know who I am without this dream, Sarah confessed to Evelyn during one of their sessions. I've always imagined myself as a mother. And now? I don't know what's left. Evelyn nodded. It's okay to mourn this loss, Sarah. But remember, your identity isn't defined by motherhood. You're more than your dreams of becoming a mother. This is a part of you, but it's not all of you. It took time, but gradually Sarah began to rebuild herself. She started focusing on her writing again, finding new inspiration in the process of rediscovery. She began volunteering at a local children's hospital, working with young patients who needed support. And although she still felt the occasional pang of longing for the child she thought she was carrying, she found a sense of peace in her new path forward. The process wasn't easy. There were setbacks, days when the sadness crept back in, but Sarah had learned one of the most important lessons of her life: healing wasn't linear. It would take time, but she would eventually find her way through the fog. As months passed, Sarah began to feel more like herself again. She was no longer defined by the idea of being pregnant. Instead, she was learning to live fully in the present, embracing the life she had. And perhaps, one day, when the time was right, she would try again to start a family. But for now, she was learning to live with her truth, to be kind to herself, and to find joy in the things that brought her peace. Months passed, and Sarah's life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The emotional weight of her phantom pregnancy still lingered, but she was learning to live with it. She had stopped asking herself what if, and had begun asking what now. A small but significant shift in her mindset. Her therapy sessions with Evelyn were helping, and Sarah had started to open up more about her personal dreams, not just the ones tied to motherhood. For the first time in years, she felt like she was finding her own identity again, apart from the idea of being a mother, apart from the expectations others had placed on her. One of the things she had always dreamed of was writing a novel. But for years, she had put that dream aside, thinking it wasn't practical, thinking there would always be something more important to do. After her ordeal, she realized that time was precious and fleeting. If she wanted to write, now was the time. The decision to start her novel came one rainy afternoon while Sarah sat by the window, looking out at the dreary weather. She'd been brainstorming ideas for a long time, but nothing had stuck. That day, however, she began writing with abandon. She didn't worry about whether it was perfect or if it would sell. It was a way to express herself, to channel everything she had been feeling into something tangible. The first few pages came easy, and before she knew it, Sarah had a first draft. It wasn't much, but it was something, a tangible piece of herself, something she could look back on and say, I did this. That novel turned into more than just a project. It became her healing. Writing helped her process the emotions she had buried. The grief, the confusion, the loss, she poured it all onto the pages. Her characters struggled with their own versions of loss and hope, and through their journeys, Sarah found clarity in her own. At the same time, Sarah had started volunteering more frequently at the children's hospital, where she became close to a young boy named Tommy. He was only 6 years old but had been undergoing treatment for leukemia. His smile was infectious, and despite the heavy burden he carried, he had a sense of hope and joy that could brighten any room. Sarah visited him every week, reading stories to him, playing games, and simply spending time with him. Through her time with Tommy, Sarah was able to understand the healing power of presence. It wasn't always about fixing things, about making everything perfect or happy. Sometimes, the greatest gift you could give someone was simply being there. In many ways, Tommy helped Sarah heal in ways she didn't expect. His bravery reminded her that life wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment, it was about finding meaning in the moments that we had. One afternoon, as Sarah was sitting by Tommy's hospital bed reading a book, he looked up at her with his big, bright eyes. "Sarah," he said softly, "you're a really good mom. You're nice and kind. I like it when you come here." Sarah's heart clenched. She had never considered herself a mother, but in that moment, she realized that she had been filling a need for Tommy, offering him the care and love he needed. She didn't have to be a biological mother to make an impact. In fact, her experience with the phantom pregnancy had opened her eyes to the many different ways a person could care for and nurture others. Tommy's words stayed with Sarah long after her visit. Maybe she wasn't going to be a mother in the way she had once imagined, but perhaps there were other ways to create the kind of impact she had always dreamed of. She had been so focused on a single idea of what motherhood could look like that she had missed the opportunities to love and care for others in the present. Sarah's journey took another turn when she decided to take a weekend trip to a quiet cabin in the mountains. She needed time to herself, a chance to reflect and recharge. The cabin was small, nestled between towering pine trees and surrounded by miles of wilderness. It was the perfect place to disconnect from everything. One night, while sitting on the porch, watching the stars twinkle in the sky, Sarah reflected on how far she had come. She had faced the emotional aftermath of the phantom pregnancy, had dealt with the crushing reality that the child she had dreamed of was never coming, and yet here she was, alive, breathing, and stronger than ever. She no longer felt like the woman who had once been consumed by the idea of motherhood. Instead, she was becoming the woman she had always wanted to be, strong, self-aware, and full of purpose. It wasn't always easy, but she was learning to embrace her own journey. The sound of the forest at night, the rustle of leaves, and the gentle hum of the wind filled the air. Sarah closed her eyes and smiled. She wasn't quite sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain, she was no longer defined by what she had lost. she was defined by the life she was living right now. As she headed back home, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. She didn't have to have everything figured out, and she didn't need to meet anyone else's expectations. She had found her own path. Whether or not she became a mother didn't matter anymore. She had learned that life was full of unexpected turns, and sometimes, those turns led to places more meaningful than anything she could have planned. As Sarah settled into her new rhythm, life began to take on a different shape. Her freelance writing was flourishing, her novel was coming along, and her time at the children's hospital became a regular part of her schedule. She was learning to find joy in the things she could control and releasing her grip on things she could not. And yet, despite the growth and healing, there was always a little voice in the back of her mind wondering if she would ever truly be at peace with her journey. One quiet evening, about 6 months after her first therapy session, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything. She was sitting on her couch, sipping a cup of tea, and reading a chapter of her novel when the phone rang. The caller ID read, "Dr. Lee's office." Her heart skipped a beat, and she hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Hi, Sarah," the receptionist said, her voice pleasant. "This is Laura from Dr. Lee's office. We've received some additional test results related to your case, and Dr. Lee would like to discuss them with you. Can you come in for a follow-up appointment?" A sudden sense of dread washed over Sarah. It had been months since her last visit. The last thing she had expected was to receive a call about her condition. She couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety rise in her chest. "Of course, I'll come in," Sarah replied, trying to steady her voice. "When is the appointment?" "We have an opening tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. Does that work for you?" "Perfect," Sarah said, even though her stomach was already in knots. "I'll be there." The next day, Sarah found herself sitting once again in the waiting room of Dr. Lee's office. The room was sterile, calm, but to Sarah, it felt suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the call was more than just a routine checkup. Her mind raced through every possible scenario, from the unlikely return of her phantom pregnancy to something far worse. When Dr. Lee entered, he greeted Sarah with a warm smile, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "Hello, Sarah," he said, sitting down across from her. "I'm glad you came in. I know this has been an incredibly emotional journey for you, but I believe we have some important information to share." Sarah's stomach turned. "What's going on, Dr. Lee? Is something wrong?" Dr. Lee paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Not wrong, but unexpected. After reviewing your previous test results and doing a bit more research on your case, we've discovered something interesting. The original ultrasound and blood tests indicated that there was no pregnancy, but we ran some new hormone panels, things we didn't test for initially. And there's been a significant shift in your hormone levels." Sarah frowned, not sure what he was getting at. "What do you mean? Are my hormone levels normal now?" "That's the thing, Sarah," Dr. Lee continued. "Your hormone levels have changed in a way that indicates you might be pregnant. But here's the twist, you're not showing any physical signs of pregnancy. No morning sickness, no weight gain. It's a very unusual situation, and frankly, it's something we've never seen before." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced. "Wait, what are you saying? You're telling me I could be pregnant, but I don't feel anything?" "Exactly," Dr. Lee said, leaning forward. "It's possible that your body had been experiencing a phantom pregnancy before, but now, it seems that something has shifted. This could mean a variety of things, one of which is that you might be early in a pregnancy, but your body is not showing the typical symptoms. The psychological factors that contributed to your phantom pregnancy may still be playing a role in your current condition." Sarah's head spun. "But I've been feeling fine. I haven't had any of the usual symptoms. You said I wasn't pregnant before. How can this be happening?" "I know this is a lot to take in," Dr. Lee said. "But what we have here is a very unique case. We don't know why your body has reacted this way, But it's possible that the stress of the phantom pregnancy has altered your body's hormonal response in a way that allowed for an actual pregnancy to occur, without the normal signs and symptoms. Sarah's mind whirled as she tried to process this new information. Could it be true? Was this just another psychological trick her body had played on her? Or was she truly pregnant? The idea that she might actually be carrying a child, after all this time, seemed almost too much to believe. Dr. Lee continued, to confirm this, we'll need to do a new ultrasound and some additional tests. I know this is a lot, and I want you to take your time to think it over, but we need to act quickly if you are pregnant, to make sure we monitor everything closely. I don't know what to think, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean, after everything, I don't even know what to believe anymore. I understand, Dr. Lee said gently. Take the time you need. But I recommend we do another ultrasound just to be sure. The next few days were a blur. Sarah couldn't concentrate on anything other than the news she had just received. Was she pregnant? Or was this another twist of fate, another cruel trick her body had played on her? She didn't know how to feel anymore. The hope that had been taken away months ago had returned, but so had the doubt, the fear, and the anxiety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah returned to Dr. Lee's office for the follow-up ultrasound. As she lay back on the examination table, the cold gel spread across her abdomen once again, she closed her eyes. She could hear the faint hum of the ultrasound machine as Dr. Lee moved the wand over her stomach. All right, Sarah, he said after a few minutes, let's take a look. The images on the screen flickered to life, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This time, the outline was clearer. A small, unmistakable shape appeared, much more defined than before. Sarah, Dr. Lee said softly, you are pregnant. The words hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. She stared at the ultrasound screen in disbelief, her mind still trying to process the reality of what she was seeing. The tiny shape, nestled inside her, was unmistakable. There was no denying it now. She was pregnant. The world seemed to shift around her as she processed the news. A wave of emotions, shock, joy, fear, and relief, washed over her all at once. She had gone from being convinced she was not pregnant to now seeing the undeniable proof. Dr. Lee smiled, his expression both reassuring and compassionate. It's early, but it's definitely there. And it's a healthy pregnancy so far. We'll monitor it closely, but this is real, Sarah. You're going to be a mother. For a moment, Sarah felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her. She was pregnant. She had waited for this moment for so long, had dreamt of it, and now, it had finally come to pass. But it wasn't the pregnancy she had once imagined, there had been no weeks of excitement, no build-up of anticipation. Instead, it had arrived in a whirlwind, a confusing mix of emotions and unanswered questions. Dr. Lee continued speaking, but Sarah's mind was racing. I know this is a lot to absorb, he said gently. Take your time. There will be more tests and ultrasounds to confirm everything, but for now, we can safely say that you are indeed pregnant. Sarah nodded numbly. She couldn't find the words. She wanted to cry, to laugh, to scream. But most of all, she wanted to make sense of the journey that had led her here. It had been a long and tumultuous road, filled with hope and loss, and now she found herself in a place she had once feared she would never reach. As Sarah left Dr. Lee's office, she was still reeling from the news. She sat in her car for several minutes, staring at her hands, unsure of what to do next. The weight of the moment was heavy, and the uncertainty of it all loomed large. She had gone from losing the dream of motherhood to suddenly finding herself in the middle of it, and it was all so overwhelming. She knew she needed to tell someone, but who? Rebecca, her best friend, had been there for her throughout the phantom pregnancy, offering support when Sarah had needed it most. But this? This was different. This was real. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed Rebecca's number, her hands trembling slightly. The phone rang twice before Rebecca answered, her voice full of warmth. Sarah. How did it go? Are you okay? She asked immediately, sensing the tension in Sarah's voice. I don't even know how to say this, Sarah said, her words coming out in a rush. But Dr. Lee just told me, I'm pregnant. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could almost hear Rebecca processing the words. Wait, what? But, after everything? How is that even possible? I don't know, Rebecca, Sarah said, her voice trembling. It's crazy. I was sure I wasn't pregnant, and then this happened. I've been through so much, and now, here we are. Rebecca's voice softened, her tone full of empathy. Sarah, this is huge. I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm so happy for you. I'm here for you, every step of the way. Whatever you need, I'm with you. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she listened to Rebecca's reassuring words. She had no idea how to navigate this new chapter in her life, but knowing that she had someone by her side gave her a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she needed. I don't know what to do next, Sarah admitted. I feel like I'm in a dream. I don't know how to be pregnant after everything I've been through. I'm scared. I don't want to get my hopes up, and I don't know if I'm ready. Rebecca's voice was steady and calm. You don't have to have it all figured out, Sarah. This is your journey, and you can take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this. And when the time comes, we'll figure it out together. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a sense of relief, but also a deep sense of fear. She had always dreamed of becoming a mother, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what it meant. How would she navigate the next few months? How would she deal with the lingering fear that this pregnancy, like the last one, might be fleeting? The days that followed were a blur of medical appointments, tests, and quiet moments of reflection. Sarah took the advice of Dr. Lee and began to adjust her life accordingly. She made changes to her diet, focused on getting enough rest, and started reading more about pregnancy and motherhood. She also continued to write, channeling her emotions into her novel, which became a cathartic outlet for her fears and hopes. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to feel more confident, though the doubt still lingered at the back of her mind. The early stages of pregnancy were always filled with uncertainty, but in her case, it was amplified by the memories of her phantom pregnancy. She couldn't help but wonder if it would all come crashing down again. But as time went on, her body began to adjust. The morning sickness that had once plagued her now made sense, and she found herself more fatigued than usual. Her belly began to grow, albeit slowly, but it was growing, and that gave her hope. She was beginning to trust the process, to believe that this time it was real. One morning, as she stood in front of the mirror, her hands resting on her growing belly, she whispered to herself, I'm going to be a mother. It wasn't the way she had imagined, but it was her journey. It was her path, and she would walk it, one step at a time. As the months passed, Sarah's pregnancy continued without incident, and she found herself growing more excited with each passing day. The fears that had once consumed her began to fade, replaced by a deep, abiding love for the child she was carrying. She began to envision what her life would be like as a mother, but this time, it wasn't about expectations or pressure. It was simply about the love and joy she felt for this little life inside of her. And when the time came to welcome her baby into the world, Sarah was ready, not because everything had gone perfectly, but because she had learned that motherhood, like life, wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about embracing the unknown, facing fears, and trusting that, in the end, everything would fall into place. With a heart full of love and hope, Sarah welcomed her child into the world, knowing that this was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter that was hers, and hers alone.